The south leg of the tower shuddered, just once, as if something down in the dark tested it with a thumb. I was supposed to work up in this tower, alone, but I wasn't alone anymore. 2 weeks earlier, the only thing rattling was my dash. The road that led to Kettle Ridge wasn't really a road, just a ribbon of ruts that slalomed through deadfall and washouts and the occasional rib of limestone jutting like a spine through the dirt. I hadn't seen another vehicle since the ranger station 40 miles back. The map they gave me was an old photocopy with coffee rings and a hand-drawn X. "Follow your altimeter more than your GPS," the station chief had said, smirking. "The satellite loses courage up there." By the time the track crested the ridge, my hands were buzzing from the wheel and the rear view was pasted with dust. The tower rose out of the timber like a spare thought, 4 steel legs cross-braced, a box of glass and shadow perched on top. The wind had that high, thin sound it gets above tree line, like the mountain is singing to itself under its breath. I killed the engine and sat for a moment listening to the sudden silence. The forest didn't meet me. It waited. Up the stairs, 76 treads, a landing at each quarter where you could look between your boots and see nothing but needles and empty air. On the final platform, the door yielded to the latch with a noise like an old book opening. Inside was a square life. Cot, stove, shelf of dog-eared fire behavior manuals, the chipped mug, the Osborne firefinder like a bronze altar at the center. Every pane of glass wore the mountain in a different mood. Orientation said I'd have eyes on 2 other towers in favorable conditions. With the high-power binoculars, I found them, a pinprick to the north where a ridge shouldered into the sky, hollow top, and a sliver to the south like a nail-head catching light, bare bone. I wouldn't have known either were there without the glass. It felt like discovering neighbors in the bones of a whale. "Mallory, Kettle Ridge, checking in," I said into the handheld after I'd set up my bedding and inventoried the canned soup. Static breathed for a beat, then a voice with canyon dust in it. "Barebone here. Miles. If you can hear me, you're too close." A second voice, bright and dry. "Hollowtop, Kara." "Welcome to the birdhouse, Evan." The first day I learned. The daily cadence. Weather at 10 and 4. Scan for columns every hour. Log wildlife if it looked like it wanted to be logged. The firefinder's compass ring slid under my fingers as if it were alive. The mountains had their own grammar. Saddles and draws and spurs and bowls. All of it laid out like sheet music you only fully heard when wind moved over it. Nights were clean and starshot. The cabin took on a ship's bridge feeling when the lantern was low and the windows made the dark a mirror. The radio's red LED was a heartbeat in a quiet chest. I could hit the cot and listen to the needles breathe and tell myself that, finally, I had stepped outside the calendar of other people's worries. Up here, time obeyed weather, and weather obeyed no one. You become a creature of observation, or you go a little unsown. By the end of week 1, I knew the local hawk by his crooked primary. I knew a drift of cloud that always broke on the same snag. I knew where the shadow of the tower legs fell at noon, and how the ground brightened a shade when a bank of thin cirrus passed. My log filled with ordinary. 0930. Cow elk on east slope below milepost 7. 1400, Virga over Bitterroot Crest. 2040, satellite track northwest to southie. "Anything interesting, Kettle?" Kara asked one evening as the sky went the bruised purple that means cold is coming. "Interesting how?" "Choose your own definition." I thought, "I can hear the phone they forgot to put on the wall." She laughed. In the background, I heard her stove tick and settle. "Give it time." The mountain starts talking once it decides you'll listen. Miles was older, radio manner that didn't mind silence. He'd chime in to read numbers with a habit that made everything sound like a poker hand. Humidity 32, winds light variable, no smoke, no nothing. Sometimes he'd tell stories that were really just lists of things he'd seen from high places. A pack train moving like punctuation through timber, cloud shadows galloping a ridge, a lightning strike brighten the world white and then take 10 full seconds to tell you where it hit. End of week 2, I'd stopped feeling like a visitor. The tower smell, oil and dust and old rain, had worked its way into my clothes. I wrote letters I didn't send, just to calibrate the shape of my own thoughts. I kept my boots by the door, laces loose, an old lookout habit from a manual that warned you to be able to move fast even when nothing asked you to. It felt superstitious. I honored it anyway. On the second Sunday, the wind died all at once. Not lessened, not fell off. It was as if a switch had been thrown and the air went still from ridge to ridge. The quiet had edges. I stood at the window and could hear tiny things, resin popping in a beam, the dry scuff of a moth against glass, the little creak when I leaned a palm on the firefinder table. Somewhere downslope a pine cone let go and pinged its way through branches with a sound like a coin falling down a stairwell. Odd stillness, I said on the radio, not because it needed saying, but because sometimes naming a thing kept it from growing larger than you. Kara's reply was quick. Copy your stillness. Miles said nothing. Then, lazily, enjoy it. Wind will tax you double for the quiet. Night rose like water in a glass. I was writing up the last line of my log when I felt it, the smallest tremor underfoot, as if the mountain had sighed and changed its mind. The lantern wick fluttered. I waited for wind to scratch the windows. Nothing. I told myself it was settling, steel cooling, wood remembering its wood. I told myself 100 sensible things. I got on the cot and listened anyway. The tower is honest with you. It repeats what the forest says. Some nights that's nothing. Some nights it is the shape of your breath and a cricket tuning its life. That night, in a lull between the world and sleep, I heard a sound I couldn't name. Not wind, not animal, not the long low of a freight train, closer than any of those, and deeper. A note you felt in your ribs before you heard it with your ear. I sat up without meaning to. The red LED on the radio made a small square of blood on the table. Barebone, hollow top, you copy? I said, thumb pressed white to the transmit key. My own voice sounded like it was in the room with me and also far away. Static curled back, patient as breath. Kara came first, surprised. Copy, Kettle. You good? I listened to the dark the way you listen to a seashell. The sound had already gone. Yeah, I said, just checking range. Range is good, she said softer. Range is real good. I put the mic down. Outside the windows, the treetops were simple black cutouts against starfield. Nothing moved. Nothing asked to. But as I eased back onto the cot, a little tremor stirred the south leg of the tower, just once, as if something down there had laid a hand against the steel to feel who lived inside. The first time it happened, I told myself it was wind. The second time, I stopped pretending. It started with a sound like a door closing somewhere in the woods, distant, hollow, and final. Then came the groan, not from the tower, not from anything made by men. It rolled through the forest in a low, lazy arc, like the mountain was stretching its back. I marked it down in the log. 2317. Low-frequency noise to the south. Unverified source. It looked like a joke written in someone else's handwriting. By morning, the air was bright and scrubbed clean, the world pretending nothing had happened. I brewed coffee thick enough to stand a spoon in and went about the routine. Smoke scans, temperature, visibility, wind. Kara crackled through the radio sometime after 10. "Morning, Kettle." "Quiet night?" I hesitated. "Mostly." "Mostly," she repeated. That a technical term? Means I didn't sleep much. Miles joined the chatter, his voice a gravelly hum. "That's your first mistake. You'll start hearing things up there if you don't sleep. Tower sings when you get tired." "I heard that too," Kara added. "It hums in the joints." Drives people crazy if they fight it. I wanted to tell them it wasn't the tower that hummed, it was something around it. Something heavy enough to make the steo complain. But I didn't. It was my second week. Nobody wants to be the guy who starts talking about ghosts of the forest before the coffee's even brewed. That night the stillness came again, thicker this time. When you're up high, you start to hear the forest like a body, all those miles of branches and roots and wind coursing through it like blood. But that night it was holding its breath. Then came the thud, a deep single sound that traveled through the metal floor up through my knees and chest. The lantern on the table quivered, the coffee cup tipped, spilled a ring of brown that soaked into my notes. I stood, heart pacing hard, pressed my palm against the nearest wall. The tower wasn't swaying. Whatever it was, it hadn't hit me. It had tested me. I grabbed the binoculars and swept the tree line. Only moonlight and the black seam of the valley, but something, just at the edge of my sight, rippled the shadows where the ground should have been solid. "Kara, Miles, you copy?" Static answered first, then Miles. "Copy. What's up? You hearing anything weird down your way?" "Define weird." "Heavy impacts, like something big moving through timber." A pause. Kara came on, her voice wrapped in sleep. "Kettle, I've got dead calm here, not even a leaf moving." "Same here," Miles added. "You sure you're not dreaming with your eyes open?" Their laughter was light, not mean, but it left me feeling smaller than my own shadow. I logged it again. Unidentified seismic noise, local. The pen trembled a little. That same night I started recording. Just a small handheld dictaphone I'd brought to capture thunder and distant rain for a sound project. I set it by the window and let it run until morning. When I played it back, most of it was ordinary. Creaks, wind, my breathing in the next room. Then, at 2:14 a.m., something new, a tone. Not quite a growl, not quite machinery. A bass note that lived under hearing, like the start of an earthquake that never comes. The recorder clipped. The microphone couldn't hold it. And under that, just barely audible, something brushing the tower leg. I didn't sleep after that. I watched the horizon until it bled orange, and when Kara radioed at sunrise, I told her everything. She went quiet for a long moment before saying, "I don't know what you heard, but that valley's got stories." My predecessor up here, woman named Heller, she used to talk about tremors that came with no wind. Thought it was ice shifting underground in summer. "You believe that?" I asked. "Doesn't matter what I believe. Just keep your light off after dark. They don't like it." "They?" "Never mind," she said quickly. "Just trust me." After she signed off, I couldn't shake the way she said they. That night, the hum returned. Steady, closer. The floorboards sighed in rhythm, the way lungs do when a sleeper turns over. I gripped the radio and considered calling it in again, but the static itself seemed to be listening. When the sound stopped, it didn't fade. It just ceased, like a breath cut short. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was expectant. Down below, something shifted, not loud, just large. And for the first time since I'd arrived, I realized the mountain might be awake, and that I was just a speck moving inside its dream. The night before it showed itself, the moon came up thin and cruel, a hook behind tatters of cloud. The tower felt balanced on the tip of it. I kept the lantern low and circled the windows with the binoculars swinging like a pendulum in my hand. Every time I lowered the glass, my reflection hovered over the dark, my face ghosted over miles of forest. I hated that. It made me feel like I was looking back at myself from the valley, small and far and already lost. Sometime after midnight, the stillness deepened into that cotton-packed quiet I'd started to dread. Then, the trees began to move. Not all of them. A band of canopy to the west, a ribbon maybe 200 yards wide, swayed once, twice, and then slow, like a thought reconsidered. There was no wind on my face. The guy line outside lay slack as rope on a dock. And yet below, crowns nodded as if something were walking through them with a practiced grace. I put the binoculars to my eyes and felt the strap pulled tight against my neck. For a second I saw nothing but leaves blacked in against a darker sky. Then the glass found it. A pale column rising between trunks, smooth and vertical, and wrong, the way a lighthouse looks if you see it inland. The column leaned, resolved into an arm, too long by half, and a hand that was not a hand so much as a length of pale articulation, ending in slow curled digits that skimmed the canopy, like a person letting their fingers trail water. The head came last. It lifted above the tree line as if the forest were a pool, and it was surfacing. Moonlight took the shape of it and set it apart from everything else. A high brow without hairline, a plane of face too smooth, features suggested rather than carved. There was a mouth, yes, a horizontal seam that did not open. The eyes were not lights. They were dark glints, reflective like wet stone. It turned, not a snap, not a jerk, but a slow, listening tilt, like an elk that's decided the rifle crack was only thunder. White fur hung in long curtains along its ribs and thighs, damp-looking, and it never snagged. Its passage parted the crowns without breaking them until it wanted to. When it wanted to, the sound was a clean pop, a suck of root, the sigh of a trunk admitting gravity. I watched one tree, 40 feet if it was a foot, tilt as if set gently on a hinge, then right itself, needles shivering. I felt the adjustment travel through the tower legs, a tremor that made a pencil shuffle on the table. I didn't think to record. I didn't think to breathe. I realized I had my free hand braced on the firefinder's bronze like it might float me. The creature moved on a path that paralleled the ridge, not toward me, not away, simply, as if it had somewhere to be, and everywhere it went was in the way only enough to notice. "Therebone, hollow top, do you copy?" I heard myself say, voice too steady, as if I'd dubbed it in later. Kara came back immediately, strain in the way she breathed the static. "Copy, Kettle. You okay?" "There's something moving west to east at my latitude," I said. "Large animal." I hated that I'd said animal. The word was a box too small. Miles sounded like he'd sat up fast. "How large?" I swallowed. The thing had paused at a stand of larch and leaned, its head sliding level with my floor. A strand of fur sluiced over a crown of needles and left them beaded with moonlight. I could have thrown a stone and hit it if the window opened that way. My mouth went dry the way it does when someone asks you to explain a dream out loud. "Large as the tower," I said. 50 feet, give or take. Silence. You can hear someone disbelieve you. It has its own weight on the line. Miles tried a joke and missed it. "You sure you're not looking at your reflection, kid?" Kara didn't laugh. "Evan," she said, my name like a hand laid on a shoulder. "Stay inside." The creature kept moving, and I followed it with the binoculars. A swing stop that made me feel like a needle on a seismograph. Every once in a while it would tilt its head and I'd get the impression of listening. Not to me, to something that ran under me or through me, the way you listen to a train before it shows up, to the faint iron song in the rails. I risked one glance down. The shadows at the base of the tower were simple. Nothing disturbed but a crescent of crushed grass where I'd dragged the water jugs earlier. When I looked back, the thing had crossed a saddle and stood with its torso screened by spruce, only the head and one long arm visible, hand curled lightly around a trunk thicker than my waist. It didn't squeeze. It steadied itself, as if the world might decide to tilt again. I tried to force thought into sequence. I made myself reach for the log and write what I could make objective. 0, 1, 1, 3. Movement west to east. Approximate elevation 7,300 feet. White fur. Estimated height 45 to 55 feet. Bipedal locomotion. No visible mouth movement. Arms elongated. Behavior slow, deliberate. Affect, listening. Affect, listening. I underlined it and felt ridiculous and relieved at once, as if naming the posture made it less cosmically absurd. The thing took another step and then another, and I realized the sound I associated with it, those low body notes, weren't accompanying the steps. They were preceding them, a faint harmonic that passed through the ground first, then the trees, then the tower, and only after did it move on that beat, as if obeying a tempo I couldn't fully hear. The tower hummed in sympathy. The windows buzzed lightly in their frames. "Evan," Kara said again, small over all that big night. "Tell me what it's doing now." "Passing," I said. I didn't know what else to call it. "It's just passing." "Good," Miles said too loud. "Let it pass." As it drew a beam of the tower, it slowed. The head turned. It didn't look at me the way you look at a person in a window. It oriented the smooth plane of its face toward the cabin as if to calibrate an instrument. The infrasound swelled, brushing the inside of my ribs with a pressure that made my eyes water. I put a palm to the glass and felt nothing but the cold of night. Somehow that disappointed me. Somehow that saved me. A minute or 10, time stacked wrong. Then it went on, the crowns closing behind it in a soft wave. The last I saw of it was a white cascade of fur disappearing down a shallow draw, the hint of a shoulder fading into alignment with trees, and then nothing but the pattern of wind where there was no wind. I realized my teeth hurt. I'd been clenching. I put the binoculars down in exactly the place they had been before I picked them up, as if I were trying to rewind the night by arranging props. "Report complete," I said, and the absurdity of the words made me bark a laugh that sounded like it belonged to a different man. Nobody said anything for a long time. Then Miles cleared throat gravel. "I got no movement here." "Kara?" "Negative," she said. "Sky clear. No wind." A pause. "Evan, keep your lights low. If it comes back, don't greet it. I wasn't planning a reception, I said, but my voice shook. The rest of the night unspooled slowly and never quite reached morning. When the ridge finally bleached toward gray and bird noise stitched itself back into the seams of the world, I dared to look through the floor grating. Down below, the duff and grass wore a line, subtle as if brushed by a giant broom. Beyond that, where the slope eased, a fir lay tilted and then set upright wrong, roots showing a little, needles tremoring in a breeze that still didn't exist. I climbed down at first light, boots careful on the steps like I was walking on the spine of a sleeping animal. The ground at the base of the south leg was packed, not in prints, no detail, but with an even, measured compression that made the earth springy underfoot, tamped in a rhythm regular as a heartbeat. 36 inches center to center. I measured with my fingers, then with the tape from the toolkit, needing numbers to say this was real. I followed the faint corridor of bent grass to the edge of the thicker timber until it vanished into a tangle of shadow and dew. In the quiet, I could hear water somewhere I'd never noticed water before, a hidden seep coming alive, as if something had pressed the mountain and made it bleed a little. Back in the cabin, I drew what I remembered, lines for limbs, shading for fur, a blank oval for a face with the suggestion of eyes. I labeled it with the same steadiness I'd use for a smoke. Subject A. I didn't write beautiful, though a part of me wanted to. I didn't write terrible, though I knew that would be true soon enough. At 10:00 I checked in. I kept the facts tight as fence wire. When I finished, Miles exhaled into the mic like he'd been holding his breath. "I seen Moose do strange things in a rut," he said, weak humor wrapped around a need to put the world back in its box. Kara only said, "Copy, Kettle. Keep recording." And Evan, "If they're walking, they're not hunting." "If who is?" I asked. But she'd already signed off. And outside, the trees, so ordinary in daylight, pretended not to remember what had moved among them. The forest went silent again on the third night after the sighting, the kind of silence that feels manufactured, like the world had been switched off to make room for something else. For a while, I convinced myself the giant had been a trick of fog and exhaustion. I even laughed about it when Miles called in the next morning. He didn't sound convinced, but he let me have the lie. Kara didn't say anything at all. 2 nights later, she broke that silence. "Evan," she said over the radio, her voice thin and shaking. "Do you hear that?" At first I thought it was static, but it wasn't. It was rhythmic, deep, deliberate, like the beat of a heart scaled up to geological size. The window glass trembled in its frame. "Miles," I said. "Yeah," came his voice. "I feel it too." The floor vibrated under my boots. Not an earthquake, not thunder. It was too measured. It was footsteps. I grabbed the binoculars and scanned north. At first, nothing. Then, between folds of moonlit fog, I saw movement. Tall silhouettes sliding through the trees, dozens of them. Long, spindly limbs gliding, each crowned with that same white fur, luminous under the moonlight like frost. A herd. They weren't moving fast. They didn't need to. The forest bent around them like grass around wind. The rhythm of their movement was hypnotic. Step, pause, rumble, step. Kara whispered through the radio, "Evan, they're coming from my side." "They're heading your way," I could hear the fear in her breathing. Miles muttered a prayer, half static, half disbelief. One of the creatures turned its head toward her tower as it passed. I couldn't see its face, only the light sliding over it. It tilted its head, the same slow, graceful motion as before, like it was memorizing where she was. Then it kept walking, joining the rhythm again. As they neared my position, the air changed. It pressed against my chest, like standing too close to a massive speaker. The sound wasn't just heard, it was felt. It made my heartbeat sync with theirs. The first of them passed maybe 100 yards from the tower. Its shoulder brushed the top of the pines. I could hear bark split, sap hissing. I ducked below the windowsill and killed the lantern. Through the cracks between boards, I saw it pause near the tower base. One hand, long, pale, and impossibly delicate, rested against the ground. The earth sank beneath its touch. I held my breath. It turned its head upward, slow as sunrise, and the blank plane of its face caught the faint reflection of the tower's glass. For one unbearable heartbeat, I thought it had seen me. Then, just as smoothly, it straightened and resumed walking north with the rest of the herd. Kara's voice broke the silence again, trembling but alive. "Evan, they're passing me again. Going north." "Count them," Miles said. Can you count them?" "No. God, there's too many. Maybe 20, maybe more. 20 of them. Each one towering over the trees, their long arms swaying in unison like pendulums. The forest below the tower rippled in their wake, waves of motion spreading outward. Branches leaned after them, as if reaching toward something ancient they recognized. For half an hour the sound continued, that deep, resonant hum that seemed to rise from the ground itself. At one point it grew so strong the tower's support bolts groaned. My teeth buzzed. I felt blood run from my nose. Then, as suddenly as it began, the sound faded. The last of the herd vanished into the valley fog. The forest remained flattened. From the tower it looked like a storm had rolled through, a perfect corridor of downed treetops stretching for miles. Kara whispered, "They're gone." Miles didn't reply right away. Then quietly, "No, they're not. They just went somewhere we can't see." After that, none of us spoke for a long time. The night hummed with leftover vibration, like the mountain was digesting what had passed through it. I finally dared to look outside. The moonlight caught something on the ridge below, prints pressed into the slope, each one the size of a compact car, perfectly circular, shallow, and warm enough to steam against the cold ground. The radio crackled again. Kara's voice was faint now, almost lost in static. "Evan." They looked up at me, all of them, at once. At once. Then the channel died. I tried to raise her for an hour. Nothing. When I called Miles, his answer was short, grim. "They're still out there." South now. I can feel them moving. And he was right. The rumble started again, distant, deep, and patient. The sound of something ancient retracing its steps through the forest. At some point before dawn, the night after the herd went north, Kara's frequency began to tick. I woke to it, a soft pip every 47 seconds, regular as a lighthouse pulse. Between the pips there was a bass murmur, an after-sound that made the window glass tremble a hair in its frame. It wasn't human, no breath, no voice, just a measured tone and the tower answering with a faint, sympathetic hum, as if metal remembered a hand. "Kara," I said. "Holotop, come back." "Kara, do you copy? Pip." I pictured her leaning over her console, finger-tapping the transmit, finding the rhythm because the rhythm had found her. Then I pictured her not there at all, only the radio and the mountain talking to each other, imitating the absence of a heartbeat. Miles came in after a long minute, voice rough, words clipped at the edges like he was rationing them. "Still south of me," he said. "Faint. They're not gone." I wrote the numbers anyway. 0441, unidentified beacon, 47-second interval. Origin, hollow top, assumed. I underlined assumed until the paper pilled. At full daylight, the valley pretended to be ordinary. The corridor where the herd had passed softened into suggestion. Birds tested the air again with fragile notes. Wind came back as if it had never left. The prints in the slope steamed no longer but held a shape like cups pressed into memory. The tick kept up through noon. 47 seconds. 47 seconds. On the hour, a roll of cloud grayed the sun and the tone thickened at the edges like distance closing in. "Evan," Miles said quietly mid-afternoon, "if she's not answering by dusk, I'm going down." "To Hollow Top?" "To the road first," he said, as if roads still meant something. "If the switchback holds." I looked at the map. Between me and Kara stood a bowl of timber the herd had sewn shut. My line of sight in the glass found Hollow Top as a fleck the color of a thought. The idea of stepping off the tower felt like volunteering to cross a cathedral floor while the ceiling lowered a stone a minute. "Wait for dark," I said, not because it was wise, but because the mountain had already chosen night as its language. "If they're moving, we'll hear it." "Yeah," he said, "we'll hear it." They came back after moonrise. You never forget the first note when it arrives, how the air goes not quiet but clear and then fills with pressure. This time the tone brought weather with it. Fog rose up from the draw like breath on glass. The trees began to lean before anything walked among them, as if the forest were reaching to be nearer to what made it itself. Then the rhythm arrived, the deep measure under my ribs, and the herd poured south through the frames of the windows, tall and pale and deliberate, as if returning along a route that had existed for longer than the pines had names. "Kara," I said into the microphone, "if you can hear me, key twice. Pip, pip." The sound came not from north but beneath the tone, like a reply put into the ground. I realized, stupidly late, that the beacon wasn't for me. It was an answer to something that had been asking since before I was born. The first of them crossed the west saddle and paused in the corridor they'd laid nights ago. Its head lifted, face toward my cabin, not seeing, not seeing, simply bringing me into its map. The infrasound swelled and the tower gave a small creak like a man bracing his knees before a lift. Another followed, and another, until the valley took on a slow-motion tide. Where they stepped, the surface of the world dipped a fraction and then rose. "Stay inside," Miles said, as if I'd been halfway out the door. Maybe I was. I had the recorder in my hand without remembering picking it up. Its tiny LED glowed as if embarrassed to still be red in the presence of that much night. The herd angled southeast and began to rake the ridge line below Barebone, their long arms easing trunks aside, palms whispering over needles. The tone changed key, just a hair, and something in my jaw clicked, a painless realignment that felt like being tuned. Then the tower answered differently. The south leg, that old, familiar leg, took a slow, thoughtful push, not a strike, a pressure, like a giant hand finding its former grip. I killed the lantern. The little room became a constellation, radio light, recorder light, the wan skeleton of the firefinder brass. Outside, the glass held a perfect reflection of my face over the procession. My ghost watched their long white passage like an ancestor in water. "Evan?" Kara's voice came, so faint I thought I'd imagined it. Not words, a shape of breath between tones. Then, clear enough to be undeniable, 2 syllables. "Don't greet." The recorder picked it. My chest picked it. I said her name and the herd stuttered a fraction of a step, as if something had flickered in their music. I don't know why I did it. Maybe because I was tired of being a weather station for fear. Maybe because the tone under everything had been teaching my body a new way to move since the first night. I opened the door quietly and stepped onto the landing. Night reached up with both hands. The first thing that struck me wasn't scale. It was temperature. The air was colder by a degree that mattered only to nerve endings. The second thing was smell. Wet stone, crushed fern, iron, like a river has in flood when it rips up its own bed and shows you the teeth it chews with. I started down the steps, knees bent like I was on a ship, recorder raised as if it could confer witness. The herd's rhythm didn't break. It simply made room for me the way a current makes room for a leaf. Not because it notices the leaf, but because it was always going to flow there anyway. "Evan," Miles said, small and furious. "Get back up." I went down. 30 treads. A landing. The tower vibrated at a frequency that made screws whisper. The fog had thickened to ribbons that moved not with any breeze but with the push and pull of the sound. I stepped to the next flight. White fur flickered between bowls trailing dew. Something moved its hand along a trunk and bark sighed in pleasure or pain. On the last landing, I stopped. The ground was 10 feet below, a dish of trampled duff pressed smooth. My boot soles tingled as if I stood too close to a transformer. The recorder's red light looked like a star in a deep well. Just a step, I told myself, idiotically, like a man convincing himself to touch a fence to see if it's live. Just one. I went down the last run and stepped onto the earth. The tone struck different, not louder, closer, as if what it vibrated had included me now. I could feel my pulse trying to match, failing, trying again. I took 2 steps toward the south leg and lifted the recorder, the way you lift a candle to read a name. Something pressed its palm to the far side of a fur. I don't have better words. Palm. It was not a paw, not a hoof. It was a broad, pale plain subdivided by long, gentle seams, pads like knots in wood. Fingers were not fingers, but lengths, articulated not at the places ours are, but at intervals that made my skin crawl to notice. It held the tree with affection and authority. The fir's trunk bowed into the pressure like a spine under a chiropractor's hand. The recorder's little condenser mic overloaded and came back, scratching the sound into digital squares. I heard my own breath quicken. I heard myself say, "It's okay," to no one I could reasonably have been addressing. The palm slid, very slightly, and the tree made a noise like a violin string bowed wrong. Sap glistened. The tone under everything made a brief harmony, then found its root again. The hand withdrew. Something, shoulder, hip, shifted in the dark and the fog parted enough for the face to find me. It did not look at me the way an animal looks. It oriented to me, which is worse. My ribs flexed on an axis my body didn't own. I felt the shape of my lungs the way a bell must feel the shape of the air inside it right before the clapper. "Evan," Miles said in my ear. The bravest thing anyone's ever said to me. Calm and firm and breaking. Walk backward. Now I couldn't. Not because I was frozen. Because the tone had reached a place in me that told my muscles a different order. Stand. Be measured. Be counted. I lifted the recorder higher. Somewhere, not in front of me, not behind, the beacon pip struck one more time. The herd answered, all at once, with a soft tightening of their chorus. The pressure increased. My eyes watered, without tears. The edges of the world grew so sharp I could hear a beetle turn over in the duff. On the recording you can hear it, the small scrape of my boot shifting, the hiss of my breath, and then a sound that is me, and also not me, a thin, involuntary noise the body makes when the ocean chooses to cover it. The file ends there. They tell the rest as paperwork. A ranger team hiked to Kettle Ridge 2 days later, when the weather radio missed 2 scheduled reports and the district supervisor couldn't raise any of us by voice. They found the tower intact, lantern on the table, mug with a ring of cold coffee like a tide line. Recorder on its side, battery dead. Radio keyed to a channel that emitted every 47 seconds, a pop that sounded almost like an old signal trying to learn a new song. There were sketches in the log, cramped the way a hand draws when it has been awake too long. Long-limbed figures, white hair textured in short strokes. Faces left blank except for 2 dark glints. The last page held a line written in block letters, steadied with a ruler as if the writer wanted no tremor to betray him. They walk when the stars are bright. They didn't find Kara. They didn't find Miles. On the slope below Barebone, they found a series of perfectly circular depressions, each the diameter of a burn barrel, pressed into the earth at 36-inch intervals and fading into a draw no one had a reason to follow before. At night, when the air is thin and the moon lifts above the ridge just so, hikers say they hear it, a faint, low music that seems to come from the ground itself. People describe a feeling like wanting to take a single step backward for no reason they can name. If you stand very still, the treetops will sway through your hair lies flat, and something you can't put into your ear will measure you gently and move on. If you enjoyed tonight's story, I worked the summer at a remote fire lookout tower in Montana, but I wasn't alone. Take a second to help this channel grow. Subscribe to Campfire Horror Stories for more cinematic long-form horror told straight from the dark edges of America's forgotten places. Like this video if you felt that chill of isolation in the tower. Comment below. Would you take the job as a fire lookout that far from civilization? Every click, every share, every new subscriber helps keep these campfires burning. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and keep your lantern close. Campfire Horror Stories, where the dark listens back.